Good morning to all our colleagues joining us from the Americas. Good afternoon to all our colleagues joining us from Africa and Europe. And good evening to all our colleagues joining us from Asia. My name's Barry Gardiner and I'm your chair for this conference. Imagine a day when you can look into the future. A day when you can see 30 years of transformative change ahead. Change that treats plant species and living creatures as essential partners in the fabric of life, rather than as objects merely for our disposal. That day was supposed to be today, the final day of COP15 in Kunming. But COVID has postponed all that. It's caused untold human misery and untold harm to the global economy. But the real question is, has it taught us the lessons we need to understand? That whatever we do for nature, we do for ourselves, and whatever we do to nature, we do to ourselves. Protect nature and we protect ourselves. But if we destroy nature, then we undermine the very support systems that sustain our own human life. COVID is a zoonotic disease, and just like SARS and Ebola and HIV before it, it's come about from the unsustainable pressure human beings have put on the natural world. If we count the global cost of COVID, we can never again say that we can't afford to halt the loss of biodiversity. The cost of meeting all the most ambitious targets that we could dream of in Kunming is a fraction of what we've already spent. The cost of not meeting them is incalculable. Now, as politicians, we're supposed to be good at taking decisions, at prioritizing. Well, getting the right outcome next year at the twin COPs of Kunming and Glasgow is the priority. That means no more business as usual, no more leave it for another government or another generation to solve. Often politicians speak as if there's a choice between an economic recovery and a sustainable green one. The truth is, unless it is sustainable and green, then it's not a recovery at all. People say the Aichi targets were too ambitious. We need to be more realistic, set achievable goals. But as legislators, many of us are saying they weren't ambitious enough. They are achievable, and realism means recognizing that there's no time to delay. Realism is about taking urgent, transformative action. So let's talk about the science and developing the data so we know what biodiversity we've still got. Let's talk about the subsidies and stop paying the polluters who are damaging our natural ecosystems. And let's set clear, ambitious targets and find the political will and the financial resources to deliver on them. Today, we've come to support the CBD, to ensure that this day next year at COP15 in China, it's a success. And we can look to the future, confident that we have one. It's now my honor to introduce the president of COP15, the Minister for Ecology and the Environment in China, His Excellency Minister Huang Ranqiu.
尊敬的戈德史密斯勋爵、伊丽莎白·穆雷马女士、女士们、先生们、朋友们，大家好！很高兴代表生物多样性公约第15次缔约方大会 COP15 东道国和主席国参加这次的峰会。生物多样性构成人类程序发展的血脉和根基。当前，生物多样性丧失和生态系统退化是人类共同面临的重大挑战。新冠肺炎疫情告诉我们，人与自然是命运共同体。中国高度重视生态文明建设和生物多样性保护，努力建设人与自然和谐共生的现代化。中国政府在习近平生态文明思想指导下，坚持山水林田湖草系统治理，划定并严守生态保护红线，建立国家公园体系，实施生物多样性保护重大工程。过去10年中国完成造林7039万公顷，治理沙化土地1776万公顷， 生态保护红线面积不低于陆地国土面积的25%，90%的陆地生态系统类型和85%的重点野生动物种群得到了有效保护。生态文明共建地球生命共同体，既是明年昆明 COP15 大会的主题，也是人类对未来的美好寄语。因疫情影响大会延期举办，这让我们有充分的时间交流，形成广泛的共识，推动 COP15 取得重要成果。中国正在积极筹备 COP15， 我们期待与各方共商全球生物多样性保护大计，制定全面平衡、有力度、可执行的2020年后全球生物多样性框架，共建万物和谐的美丽世界。2021年底，英国将举办联合国气候变化框架公约第26次缔约方会议 COP26， 中方愿与英方一道，共同推动将 COP15 和 COP26 办成具有里程碑意义的大会。女士们、先生们，习近平主席在今年9月30日召开的联合国生物多样性峰会上，向全世界发出了昆明之约。我期待明年与各位相聚美丽的春城昆明。最后，预祝本次峰会取得圆满成功。谢谢大家。
With those words fresh in our ears, I was to move straight to Minister Huang's counterpart, President of COP26, the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Alok Sharma. However, I understand that he has been delayed on his flight back from South Korea, and that Lord Goldsmith will now convey the message that Secretary Sharma was going to give us in person.
Thank you, Barry. So I'm looking forward to speaking shortly as part of the panel, but in the meantime, I have a very short message from my friend and colleague Alok Sharma, the COP26 President Designate, sends his very sincere apologies that he can't be here today. He is flying back on a delayed flight from Korea as we speak. He just wanted me to emphasize how important it is that we tackle the linked biodiversity crisis and the climate change crisis in an integrated fashion and in a meaningful way. A success at Kunming is vital if we're going to have a success at COP26 and vice versa. And he's looking forward to continuing to work very closely with China and Minister Huang as the host of COP CBD 15 to address these challenges of global importance.
Thank you so much. We're now going to move to the live panel part of our conference, and I want to set out how we'll proceed. Each of the speakers will speak for about 5 minutes. Then we will move to questions and answers to the panel. I want to thank everyone who submitted questions in advance, and we'll try and select as many as we can to make this as interactive as possible. I'll indicate if people are speaking too long, or if you're just speaking too boringly by tapping on this. So if you hear that noise, you'll know that you're to be quiet quickly. Please understand, this was my mother's glass, and if I have to tap it too hard, it will shatter, and she wouldn't like that. So if it does, it's not me, it's my mother you will have to answer to. Now, you're all on this conference because of the amazing lineup of speakers that we have. I'm not going to spend time reciting their incredible achievements. You know who they are. They know who they are. So I now invite the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, Elizabeth Maruma Marema, to address us. Elizabeth.
Barry, sorry to interrupt you. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, I know you ran into some difficulties to play a video speech by Minister Huang, but my office have get in touch with your headquarters. Now we can play from the embassy. Can we go ahead with the playing Minister Huang's video message?
It has been played. It was played on the YouTube. So it has been available. So many of the people on the call are also looking at the YouTube, and it's been played on the YouTube. So please don't worry. There hasn't been a problem.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. But I'm glad to have been able to provide you with reassurance on that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Can we now move to Elizabeth Marima?
Thank you. Gentlemen. Permit me first to thank All Party Parliamentary Group on International Conservation and its chair, Honorable Member of Parliament, you, Mr. Barry Gardiner, for the invitation and for the opportunity to address this audience. Let me begin by reminding ourselves that the adoption of the convention stemmed from the growing international recognition that biological diversity is a global asset of tremendous value to the present and future generations, and that human activities were and are still gravely endangering it. Biodiversity is the foundation of human life. We cannot live without the biodiversity that feeds us, houses us, cures us, and provides us with the water we drink and the air we breathe. However, recent assessments have painted a stark picture. Last year, IPBS Global Assessment Report warned us that nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history. Earlier this year, the World Economic Forum's annual Global Risks Report identified climate change and nature loss as two of its most critical environmental risks. Their destruction of nature, eroding the world's ecosystem services, underpin $44 trillion of economic value, virtually over half of the world's total GDP. More recently, our own 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook provided the final assessment of the progress we have made on the Aichi biodiversity targets. Unfortunately, none of the targets have been completely met. And out of the 20 targets, only 6 will be partially achieved by the end of this year. The report comes as the COVID-19 crisis challenges us to rethink on our relationship with nature, to consider the profound consequences of our own well-being and the survival that can result from the continuing loss of biodiversity and degradation of ecosystems. As the global community faces one of the greatest health, economic, social, and environmental and developmental challenges of our time, we must ask ourselves, how can we prevent this from happening again? Certainly, these challenges are multifaceted and they thus cannot be tackled in isolation. We are at a pivotal period in history, a period which requires visionary leadership and action to redirect our development pathways, drawing on the best science. Our Conference of the Parties 15, that will take place in Kunming, China next year, as well as the preparatory road ahead of it, represents a landmark moment for the global community. We are working closely with our host government to ensure a historic and successful meeting, one that will hopefully witness the adoption of a robust, ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework and announcements of ambitious commitments from governments and other stakeholders. The post-2020 global biodiversity framework will play a pivotal role in building resilience in the face of growing socio-economic challenges. It will galvanize the global community to seek collaborative, multi-stakeholder joint solutions across several sectors. It is our hope that this framework will serve as an umbrella strategy also for many other multilateral environmental agreements, organizations, and non-state actors, providing coherent guidance and support to the international community to conserve and sustainably use biological diversity and ecosystems. Similarly, it will assist and contribute in parallel to the implementation of other global goals, such as the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The UN Summit on Biodiversity that took place last month, September, was an important milestone on the road to COP15. It highlighted the strong interlinkages between climate change, biodiversity loss, and land degradation. It further reminded the international community that nature-based solutions, building on the preservation and restoration of biological diversity and ecosystems, offer an important opportunity for shared progress towards the decade of action for sustainable development. The outcomes of COP15 will send strong and timely signal to the important discussions that will lead us all to Glasgow Climate Change Conference. These meetings have the responsibility to determine the international frameworks and guidance to help countries achieve this transition to eliminate poverty while protecting our fragile natural systems. Therefore, we need to ensure coherent and collective push to address the twin threats of climate change and biodiversity loss. And in this regard, I commend the efforts of the governments of the United Kingdom and our host China in striving to highlight the interlinkages between biodiversity loss and climate change and exploring ways to ensure synergies in the successful outcomes of both our COP15 and climate COP26. The need for effective multilateralism has never been greater or more urgent than today. We will need transformative changes of our development models, as well as a whole of government, whole of society integrated approaches on the basis of shared responsibility and global solidarity in order to restore and protect nature, thereby ensuring the integrity and advancement of human well-being. Greener and sustainable post-COVID-19 recovery approaches provide an opportune moment for such transformation. In order to achieve the level of transformation required, we need to work hand in hand with all sectors to reinforce the political importance of biodiversity at the highest levels. This is the reason parliamentarians have a very important role to play in the lead up to the adoption of this ambitious framework. Let us work together, take the actions needed for the sustainable future and to achieve our 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Thank you very much for listening.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. And if one word stood out in all that you said, it was that word responsibility. There is a huge responsibility on all of us, you at the convention, but in particular, of course, on our hosts in Kunming. And that's why I'm delighted now to turn to His Excellency, the Ambassador from China to the United Kingdom, His Excellency Liu Jiaming.
It is your delight to join you at the International Legislators Summit, Protecting Nature, the Road to Kunming, hosted by the APPG on International Conservation. In 2021, China and the UK will host COP15 and COP26 respectively. These are two big events, not only for China and the UK, but also for global governance on the environment. Therefore, 2021 can well be called a big year for global governance on the environment. In exactly 200 days, COP15 will be held in Kunming, China. It is highly significant and meaningful that we gathered online today to warm up for this conference. As we speak, COVID-19 is still ravaging the world, protecting biodiversity becomes an increasingly prominent and important task. At the UN Summit on Biodiversity last month, President Xi Jinping said, "We need to take up our lofty responsibility for the entire human civilization. We need to respect nature, follow its laws and respect it. We need to find a way for man and nature to live in harmony, balance, and coordinate economic development and ecological protection, work together to build a prosperous, clean, and beautiful world." At COP15, the parties will focus on the theme of ecological civilization, building a shared future for all life on Earth, and strive to reach agreement on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. By hosting COP15, China will display three determinations. First, the determination to promote ecological conservation. China has made vigorous efforts to advance and practice the concept of ecological conservation. We believe that clear water and green mountains worth more than mountains of gold and silver, and the sound ecosystem is in the interest of everyone. COP15 will be the first global conference of United Nations that focuses on ecological conservation. It will send a powerful message of building a shared future for all life on Earth. Second, the determination to protect biodiversity. We have stepped up national legislation for preserving biodiversity. We're drawing red lines for protecting ecosystem. We have set up national park system, carried out major biodiversity conservation projects, and increased public participation and awareness. Over the past 10 years, China has increased forest coverage by more than 70 million hectares, which was more than anywhere else in the world. COP15 will serve as an important platform for China to share its practice and experience in biodiversity protection with the rest of the world. Third, a determination to take part in global diversity governance. China was one of the first to sign and ratify the Convention on Biological Diversity. It has fulfilled its obligations under the CBD. Together with its partners, China has initiated the Belt and Road Initiative, International Green Development Coalition, to set up protection of biodiversity and ecosystem. Under the framework of South-South cooperation, China has also made vigorous efforts to help other developing countries build up their capacity in managing the environment. At COP15, the post-2020 global biodiversity framework will be formulated, which will chart a course for global governance on biodiversity in the coming 10 years and beyond. Ladies and gentlemen, China and the UK are important partners in global governance on the environment. First, China and UK should follow the strategic guidance of our leaders and step up coordination and cooperation on hosting COP15 and COP26. Last month, President Xi Jinping announced that China will strive to peak carbon dioxide emissions by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Boris Johnson have reached the important agreement on enhancing coordination and mutual support on COP15 and COP26. Going forward, China and UK will step up coordination and cooperation with regard to policies and agenda of the two conferences, making them support each other and succeed together. Second, China and UK should deepen green cooperation and take the lead in global sustainable development. China and UK can enhance green cooperation in areas such as climate change, biodiversity protection, low carbon economy, green finance, green technology, and energy transition. We can also step up tri-party cooperation in building the Green Belt and Road. Third, China and UK should uphold multilateralism and help build synergy among the parties for better governance on biodiversity. Both China and UK should uphold the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, ensure fair and equitable sharing of benefits, and accommodate developing countries' concerns over funding, technology, and capacity building. We need to build a fair and reasonable multilateral system of environmental governance where all parties should shoulder their due responsibilities. Ladies and gentlemen, at the UN Summit on Biodiversity, President Xi Jinping said, "I want to welcome you to Kunming, the beautiful city of eternal spring next year, to discuss and draw our plans together for protecting global biodiversity and work in concert to build a beautiful world of harmony among all beings on the planet." As the host and incoming president of COP15, China will exert every effort to get everything ready for the conference and make it a milestone in global governance on the environment. Let's join hands to write a new chapter of ecological conservation and build a shared future for all life on the earth. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you so much. And I'm sure that you had not heard Elizabeth's speech before you prepared your own, but they could not have dovetailed more appropriately. She talking about responsibility, which you picked up on in your own remarks, and the word that came over again and again, shared, shared, shared responsibility. And that commitment to a shared responsibility and to looking at the global order and making sure that that is strong is something that I think we all welcome and really look forward to working with you as the hosts of the COP next year. Thank you so much for those remarks.
Thank you.
Next, I would ask Her Excellency Barbara Creasy, South Africa's Minister of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, to take the floor. Barbara, are you with us?
I am. Thank you very much, Barry, and good evening and greetings and salutations to all my fellow ministers, our esteemed ambassadors, our parliamentarians, and the distinguished delegates. Let me start by saying that it is indeed an honor to be part of this dialogue. And I would want to take the opportunity to sincerely thank the organizers for inviting me to participate at a time when humanity is at a crossroads due to the unprecedented rate of biodiversity loss, land degradation, and the effects of climate change. Scientists have repeatedly told us that our planet is at a tipping point. And Excellencies, we know that it is now 3 decades since the adoption of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and yet biodiversity loss still continues at a rate which is now threatening the achievement of 14 of the Sustainable Development Goals. I would also want to echo the words of other speakers who have raised concern that none of the 20 Aichi targets were fully met. This places, as others have said, an enormous burden on all of us to ensure that the outcomes of the upcoming CBD COP deliver an ambitious and well-designed post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We need clear targets that will put nature on a path to recovery in the next decade and beyond. We need a clear plan to enable people, particularly in developing countries, to secure their lives and livelihoods in harmony with nature. Excellencies, we meet today as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to undermine socio-economic development across the globe. This has added to the challenges faced by many developing countries, particularly on the African continent. The pandemic has adversely impacted on resource availability at a time when the region is facing a multitude of interrelated problems, including rising debt levels. This puts attaining the Sustainable Development Goals and the aspirations of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, at risk. On the conservation front, the global decline of tourism has placed considerable strain on the financial sustainability of protected areas on our continent. Loss of income by communities living on the borders of protected areas increases food insecurity and threatens a rise in illicit trade in wild species. This, in turn, as we all know, will impact further on the vexed question of biodiversity loss. Our own country, South Africa, as you know, is one of the 3 mega biodiverse nations on Earth. Yet we have not been spared the effects of the pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis on our conservation efforts. Our nation's biodiversity provides an array of benefits to the economy, society, and human well-being, and there still remain opportunities to be unlocked through biodiversity-based economic activities. Even before the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, our 2018 National Biodiversity Assessment highlighted the urgent need to address threats from habitat loss due to fragmentation and degradation, pollution, impacts on wetlands, climate change, and invasive alien species. The assessment prioritized efforts directed at improving habitat connectivity and restoration, protecting wetlands and strategic water sources, enhancing ecosystem resilience, conservation of species most threatened and vulnerable to extinction, and towards regulating or prohibiting activities which have an adverse impact on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Accordingly, as our country implements our economic recovery plan, we have prioritized public employment in areas such as restoration of wetlands, water sources, and other ecosystem services. Ladies and gentlemen, at a regional level, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services 2018 indicates once more that biodiversity is diminishing at unprecedented rates, with current consumption and production patterns overshooting the Earth's carrying capacity and threatening our collective future. Accordingly, here on the African continent, we do sincerely hope that the post-2020 global biodiversity framework will indeed provide our continent with a new opportunity to shape the global plan for sustainable development and biodiversity into a meaningful and responsive tool for the continent's developmental ambitions. It is our considered view that this can only be achieved if we can agree on certain common principles. The first of these, as other speakers have mentioned, is multilateralism. While we respect the sovereign rights of all countries over their own biological resources and the need for countries to address the overriding priorities of socio-economic development and the eradication of poverty, we also believe that any retreat from multilateralism threatens our collective global responsibility and ability to tackle shared and critical global risks to biodiversity. In this regard, we also think it is important, as others have said, to foster synergies in multilateral environmental agreements, particularly the CBD on biodiversity loss, the UNFCCC on climate change, and the UNCCD on desertification, drought, and land degradation. We motivate this from an understanding that the challenges we face in each of these areas are deeply interlinked. Our third principle is that there needs to be equal ambition and equal treatment of the 3 objectives of the CBD, namely conservation, sustainable use, and access and benefit sharing of genetic resources. The 3 objectives of the CBD are the main pillars towards the achievement of the 2050 vision for biodiversity of living in harmony with nature, and therefore they should be properly reflected in the post-2020 framework. Lastly, we remain convinced that if we are to achieve ambitious goals, these ambitious goals need to be equally matched with ambition with regard to the means of implementation, which must include, but is not limited to, finance, capacity building, and cooperation of sharing of technological innovations. The burden for biodiversity conservation in the post-2020 governance cannot be unduly placed on the shoulders of developing countries, who remain today the custodians of biodiversity, especially mega biodiverse countries. And I suppose it would be very interesting in the question and answer session to discuss how, if developing countries are to shoulder this burden for the world, they should be adequately compensated. We must observe the principle of common but differentiated approach to conservation, while noting that the parties at COP15 are not renegotiating the text of the convention. And we hope that COP15 will result in enhancing sustainable use and realizing a fair and equitable share of benefits from the use of genetic resource incentives, as well as promoting a whole society approach to the protection of biodiversity and ecosystems. If we understand that climate change will affect different nations and different communities within nations in different ways, the same can also be said for biodiversity loss and the ways it will manifest differently according to local conditions. In particular, we understand that these phenomena will impact most severely on women, who are primarily responsible for the provision of food and water in rural African communities. This makes the mainstreaming of our responses to biodiversity loss and ecosystem restoration and conservation so very important on our continent. Equal attention should be given to the priority work under the Biosafety Protocol and the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing, both of which are critical to sustainable development. It is also imperative that COP15 observe evidence-based decision-making and respects the outcome of science and global assessments. We cannot afford to ignore the predictions from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and nor the grim projection that almost 1 million species are facing extinction. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, a successful COP15 will therefore be one where parties agree to adopt a framework that is both ambitious and realistic in the adequate and predictable means of implementation. The framework must be based on well-designed goals and targets formulated in clear and simple language, and capacity building initiatives will be crucial to ensure that there is a robust process of accountability and reporting. Excellencies, I would like to conclude by saying that both the pre- and the post-2020 biodiversity era should be premised on inclusivity, which integrates all stakeholders, including women, Indigenous people, local communities, youth, and civil society. We must ensure that we leave no one behind. As the well-known African proverb says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I thank you.
Minister Creasy, thank you so much. You set out a clear plan to ensure that development and sustaining the natural ecosystems go together. You've raised so many issues of illicit trade, of food security, of the role of women and the vulnerability of some of the poorest communities. You've talked about the NBSAPs and their importance in structuring this, and inclusivity has been at the heart of what you said. It was a very powerful reminder of all the things that the CBD is about, and I'm sure it will form very much the basis of our discussion in the question and answer. So thank you very much for that. I now want to move from South Africa to West Africa as I invite His Excellency Lee White, CBE, the Minister of Water, Forests and Seas and the Environment in the Gabonese Republic, to address us. Could I please ask speakers, we do want to have a considerable time for discussion and questions. And I know there are so many things that our keynote speakers want to get across, but if we could try and limit time to about 5 minutes, as we requested, that'd be really helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barry, and good evening, everybody. I think when it comes to success, CBD 16, for me, the fundamental thing is coming out with a recognition.
Mic on, mic off.
Ecosystems, biodiversity, and climate are inexorably linked. I'll give two examples just as a forest country. Gabon, 88% covered in tropical rainforests. There's hordes of scientific literature now to show that biodiverse forests stop more carbon, and biodiverse forests are more resilient to climate change, resisting insect attack, resisting fires, and so on. Whether you're in Europe, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in South America. I've been muted, apparently. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Lee. Yeah, I think we're also hearing Galaxy A20. I don't know who Galaxy A20 is, but if they could mute as well, then that would stop any interruption. If everybody who's not speaking can just mute themselves, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. Second example is one that traumatizes me. If we lose the forests of the Congo Basin through deforestation, we lose the incredible biodiversity of the Congo Basin. We also lose the ecosystem services that the Congo Basin provides. So we lose, our chance of a 2-degree world. If we lose Congo Basin and all that carbon goes into the atmosphere, we're heading for a 3, 4, 5-degree world. But we also lose the rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands and the rainfall in the Sahel, which is generated by the Congo Basin forests. So we lose the Blue Nile, and then we lose agriculture in Egypt. And so there are these incredible links between biodiversity preservation, forests, ecosystem services, which bring the whole of the African continent together. And if we disrupt them, are going to create hundreds of millions of climate refugees. Not millions, not tens of millions, but hundreds of millions. We're going to see the entire African continent destabilized if we lose these ecosystems. And that's very much a biodiversity issue, and it's very much a climate change issue. So we need to see a real commitment to recognizing natural capital in our economies. We need a sort of a COVID-sized response to the extinction crisis that we're going through, and to the climate change crisis. And we have to, between COP16 and COP26, between the biodiversity and the climate COPs, we really have to raise our ambitions. We have to push for 30% of the land and 30% of the ocean protected by 2030, and we really have to have much greater global emission, both for climate and for biodiversity. Thank you.
Minister, thank you so much. And you've drawn our focus and our attention to that second great lung of the planet in the Congo Basin. So often when people talk about deforestation and the problems of maintaining our tropical rainforest, they think only of the Amazon. But of course, the Congo Basin is a huge source, both of rainfall, as you've suggested, and of livelihoods on the continent. And that challenge that you've posed to us about what happens if that is lost, if those livelihoods are lost, and the crisis and the destabilization, the refugees that could result from that, is a huge challenge to the world, and one that very much is at the heart of why we need the CBD to be ambitious in its work next year. So thank you so much for that. Integral, of course, to the success of the CBD is finance. And the UN's financial mechanism for the Rio Conventions, including the CBD Convention, is the GEF, the Global Environment Facility. And it's with great pleasure that I now turn to our very dear friend, the chair and the CEO of the Global Environment Facility and former Minister of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica, Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, to speak to us. Carlos.
Okay. Thank you so much, Barry, and thanks for the invitation to join the larger ICCF family today in this great event, and my greetings from Costa Rica to the ministers and the members of Parliament. Barry, not only the CBD is turning 30 years old, also the GF is turning next year 30 years old. This beautiful, great, mature, solid, and effective partnership that was created 30 years ago to help and support countries in their effort to implement the different environmental commissions. And as we see back in time, in the last 30 years, the human civilization has done great in terms of Human Development Index. Today, life expectancy for humans are higher, people are healthier, better educated, had more opportunities than 30 years ago. Unfortunately, Barry, in these last 30 years, we have lost a lot of forests. There's more carbon in the atmosphere. There is more plastic and less fish in the ocean. So every environmental indicator has decreased in the last 30 years, even though in terms of human development, we have done great before. And I want to be very clear, before the pandemic. That means that this great progress that we have done in terms of human development is not sustainable because nature underpins human well-being and sustainability. And here's where we have a great, unique opportunity, not just in the context of the recognition of this broken relationship with the human and nature that has generated this pandemic, but in the context of redefining our economic model, that next year we'll have many important events, and one of them definitely is COP 15. The Director General of the CBD just told us a while ago, and the Minister from South Africa, how wrong we did in terms of implementing the Aichi target. And as I read GBO 5, which is the assessment, the Global Biodiversity Assessment, which is the assessment on how we did in implementing the Aichi targets, two things jump very clearly to me. One is that, and these are the two main barriers that we need to address in the incoming new framework for 2030. One is political incoherence. You know, we invest more financial resources in activities that generates biodiversity loss and climate change than what we invest in protecting nature and keeping the temperature, as scientists tell us. And this is basically implementing Aichi target number 3 that told us that we need to go from perverse incentives into positive incentives. Barry, today we humans invest 142 times more financial resources in activities related to energy, mining, and agriculture than what we invest in forest conservation. So we got a big political issue in terms of policy coherence. And this second element that was clear to me when I read GBO 5 is Aichi target number 20, which says that we need to mobilize financial resources like never before, but from all sources. And here, even though during this last period, international support for developing countries in nature conservation has doubled, and even though countries has done way better in terms of allocating public resources to public expenditure, that hasn't been enough. And this is a key element. Just to have a perspective, the GF mobilizes just 1% of the total finance for nature conservation at the global level on an annual rate. And we need to be able to upscale not just funding, but have the efficiency behind funding. So in the context of what we want to see in the new biodiversity CBD framework, countries are very much aligned with the scientific recommendation of protecting 30%. And there's a lot of reports, economic reports that has been published this year that tell us the economic rationale behind protecting 30%. And there's a couple of them that tell us that for every dollar that we invest in protected areas in nature conservation, there's a return of $7 to $8. So I tend to believe that at the end of the day, the 30% target is very short. Based on this rationale, can you imagine the benefits of protecting 50% of the planet? Nevertheless, my point here is, as countries agree on a way by which we can protect 30% of the planet and achieve the political recommendation is key. It is key that also we are able to agree on a resource mobilization target. We need, and we have done the numbers, and the reports are very consistent that tell us that we need to mobilize at least 1% of global GDP by 2030 in order to be very successful on this. And once more, the economic rationale is there. If nature provide benefits as up to 40% of global GDP, investing 1% of global GDP from all sources is a key element. And I tend to believe that the GF is the partner of choice to support countries in this effort. Thank you so much, Barry.
Carlos, thank you. And I'm sorry to cut you short there, but because you're focusing on something that is absolutely critical, and that is how we do this, financing it, getting the resources there. That's what you're all about at the GEF, and that's what the CBD needs. Now, Carlos, of course, you moved to Washington to take up your role with the GEF, but our next speaker is a true Washington insider. I'm talking about Hank Paulson, Henry Paulson Jr., who was the 74th US Secretary to the Treasury and now chairs the Paulson Institute. Now, I think, as with Minister Huang, Secretary Paulson has had to do a pre-record. And for those of you who are on the Zoom, it's important that you see that on YouTube, because I don't think it can be played on the Zoom. I should have indicated that before Minister Huang spoke. And the Zoom link has now been put up on the screen for the Zoom call. So if you can tune into it that way, that's the best way to do it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barry. I'm delighted to participate in this event alongside such an esteemed group. If there's one lesson I've learned throughout all my years as a conservationist, it's that nature needs advocates. So I'm thankful for all the work that the ICCF is doing, and I'm greatly encouraged that biodiversity is beginning to move into the global agenda in such a meaningful way. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed a fundamental flaw in our collective ability to deal with predictable global crises. It should have been a wake-up call, and yet we are in danger of sleepwalking into another disaster, this one caused by staggering biodiversity loss. Our planet is losing 1,000 times the natural rate of up to 1 to 5 species per year. And if we continue the trajectory we're on, we face a future where up to 50% of all species may be lost by the middle of the 21st century. To date, voluntary biodiversity targets that have been set by UN initiatives, like the one currently underway, have failed miserably because of a collective failure of policymakers to act. Instead, the problem has accelerated. Why? In my view, the single most important reason that we're on this path is that our political and economic systems and financial markets do not properly account for the services nature provides. Policymakers often consider nature's benefits free, and because market pricing of many of nature's services is difficult, they are often valued at zero. This means that conserving the environment is not adequately rewarded financially, and damaging it is not appropriately penalized. Instead, the tendency is to prioritize immediate economic gains over the long-term well-being and prosperity of current and future generations. This is plainly unsustainable, and the risks are growing. And as with any serious risk we face, the rational response is to hedge. This means taking a comprehensive, worldwide effort to value, protect, and restore nature. That's why my institute, together with our partners, recently published a groundbreaking report called Financing Nature, Closing the Global Biodiversity Financing Gap. It offers what I believe is the clearest economic case to date for conserving and protecting nature. It drills down and examines global financial flows into biodiversity protection and offers a pragmatic path forward, identifying and analyzing in very specific terms the key policies and financing mechanisms necessary to arrest the alarming decline in global biodiversity. I encourage you to read the report, but let me offer three of the most important takeaways. First, the role of government is central to providing the right policy and regulatory structure. Tax breaks, incentives, and regulatory requirements all could drive meaningful change. At the same time, governments must begin the politically fraught process of diverting subsidies away from environmentally harmful activities, particularly dysfunctional agricultural policies, and toward those that protect and sustainably manage nature. Without such measures, the private sector's contribution will be very limited. But governments alone cannot deliver the financing needed to protect our planet. This brings me to my second point, the potential of the private sector. As we've seen with the growth of green finance, the private sector is willing and able to invest, but they will only deploy capital for conservation projects that promise economic returns. So we need to adjust our thinking about nature's value. We should create a new asset class for certain natural resources, such as protective soils, crop pollination, and watersheds. These are all valuable assets, and harnessing the power of markets can help to preserve and protect them from destruction. My third point is that government action to halt biodiversity loss and incentivize the private sector to invest in nature is both important and urgent. I know from experience that in a time of crisis, urgent issues are often given priority over what's important. But properly valuing nature is arguably the most important task for governments over the next decade, and the urgency is increasing day by day. As governments work to kickstart their economies after COVID-19, at a time when large amounts of fiscal stimulus will be necessary, it is essential that finance ministers understand the economic rationale and make the case for a green recovery. So initiatives like this, which are focused on ensuring that our economic systems and markets value nature, are urgently needed. This is extremely important. The advocacy from ministers of the environment and foreign ministers is absolutely necessary. But if we don't get finance ministers on board here, we are destined to fail. The agreement between governments that we expect to emerge from the CBD COP 15 in Kunming, China next year will be an important element of the global response to biodiversity loss. But while coordination and targets are necessary, it's the national responses, the legislation, policies, and regulations that are the key to delivering real changes. I know we have a number of legislators participating in this event today. Your importance cannot be overstated in terms of influencing government positions ahead of the negotiations through committee work, developing legislation to give credibility to the targets, ensuring budget allocations to mobilize sufficient resources, and importantly, holding governments to account to ensure they deliver on their promises. In particular, I am very pleased the Chinese Minister for Ecology and the Environment, Wang Runqiu, is participating today, as I believe China has an opportunity to be a leader on this issue, just as it is in green finance. I've always believed that a healthy planet is good for business. It's far cheaper to prevent environmental damage than to clean it up afterwards. For much of my career, this was a lonely position in the corporate world. But in recent years, something has changed. I've seen a new sense of urgency around nature conservation issues, a rapidly growing interest in the field of green and sustainable finance, and a renewed sense that collective effort can make a difference. So I'm optimistic that investing in nature can and will move into the mainstream of the financial world, and do so soon, so that we can arrest the alarming biodiversity decline of our planet. Finally, I'd like to emphasize that, although the economic case for protecting nature is compelling, we should keep in mind that there is an overwhelming case for preserving nature for its own sake. Nature is a great source of beauty, inspiration, innovation, and intellectual interest. Indeed, of everything that is good about life. In that sense, it is priceless. Finally, a big thank you to all of you for participating in today's event. I really look forward to learning from the rest of today's discussion.
Mic on.
Well, they used to say that a banker was a person who knew the price of everything but the value of nothing. I think we can agree that in Hank Paulson we have a banker who does understand the value of nature and the true wealth of nations. So it's great to have that endorsement from him for the work that we're doing. And if you haven't actually seen the report that his institute has produced, I would recommend it. It's a superb document and has some very specific proposals about how countries should be adopting the CBD proposals for next year and looking at how they're going to finance them at a national level. Finally, it's a great pleasure for me to call the Lord Goldsmith of Richmond Park, who is the UK Minister for Pacific and the Environment, or Zach to his friends. Zach and I have fought probably on opposite sides of politics for most of our lives. But when it comes to the environment, we are in total agreement that we have to leave our planet in a better place than we found it. So it's a great pleasure to hand over to you, Zach.
Thank you so much, Barry. I mean, the day this group was launched, I think about a year and a half ago, feels, well, in fact, in real terms, is a different age. It just feels so separate to where we are today. Real pleasure to follow Hank. I'm looking forward to reading his report, and also Minister White and Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, who are, I think, some of the world's greatest champions for the environment and are true leaders in this area. If there's a silver lining to coronavirus, it'll be that it has served as a wake-up call. We know that the virus itself is likely the consequence of our abusive relationship towards nature, but we also know that it will be dwarfed by other consequences. Last month, we learned populations of key species have declined by more than 2/3 in my lifetime. 1 million species or so face extinction. A staggering 450 football pitches of forest will be destroyed by the time I finish this speech, if I stick to my time, with appalling consequences for biodiversity and our climate. Now, clearly, this is an ecological catastrophe. We know that. but it's also an economic catastrophe. The world's poorest people suffer first and worst when the free but rarely valued services that nature provides begin to fail. Around 1 billion people depend directly on forests for their livelihoods. Around 1 billion people depend directly on fish for their main source of protein. But fundamentally, all of us, without exception, depends completely on the natural world that we inhabit. So turning this trajectory around is without a doubt the principal challenge of our age. At the UN a few weeks ago, leaders from 76 nations, including our own Prime Minister, signed an unprecedented, powerful pledge for nature and made the commitment to taking 10 urgent actions to reverse the decline of nature by 2030. And I genuinely think it is the most ambitious and radical and bold of such statements that I'm aware of. And I'm proud of the role the UK played in crafting and strengthening it. But the real challenge is turning those powerful words into action. And were it not for the pandemic, today we'd likely be reflecting on the outcome, on the closing part of the UN conference on biological diversity in Kunming, where all 196 parties were due to adopt biodiversity targets for the next decade. So I echo Minister Huang's ambition. Let's use this enforced hiatus as an extended run-up. Let's maximize the opportunity that we now have with the additional time. And we know that with the cost of renewables plummeting and zero emissions vehicles on the cusp of becoming mainstream, that it's already clear that there's a fair wind building behind the low carbon revolution. In the 12 years since the banking crisis, the cost of solar has dropped by 90%. Global investment in new renewables now exceeds investment in new fossil fuel. I think it's revealing that US coal use has declined far faster under this administration than it did under the previous one. So the market is ahead of the politics in many respects, but that is not true for nature. And that's the challenge I think that we need to address urgently. We know there is no pathway to net zero or the sustainable development goals that does not involve protecting and conserving nature on a massive scale. Nature-based solutions, protecting, restoring mangroves, forests, peatlands, and so on, could provide around 1/3 of the most cost-effective climate change solutions we need, while also supporting a species recovery and helping communities adapt to become more resilient. But despite that huge contribution they could make, they nevertheless attract less than 3% of global climate finance to date. And that's wrong, and that needs to be changed. So the UK will use our presidency of COP26 to persuade other countries to put nature at the heart of their climate response, as we're attempting to do here in the UK. We're doubling our international climate finance to 11.6 billion. We're committed to spending a significant chunk of the uplift on nature-based solutions, and we're encouraging others to do similarly. And on the back of that, we are rolling out some really ambitious new programs on land and sea, a new £500 million Blue Planet Fund, for example, to help protect marine ecosystems from key human threats like plastic pollution, illegal fishing, and so on. A new £100 million Landscapes Fund to link threatened ecosystems, providing a safe passage for wildlife and green jobs for people. It builds on the success of the Kavango-Zambezi river basins, where people from 5 nations come together to protect the home they share with half of the continent's remaining savanna elephants. We're trebling funding for the Darwin Initiative to 90 million over 3 years to support sustainable livelihoods and endangered species. We're increasing Darwin Plus for our overseas territories, and we're investing £30 million over 3 years to protect species from the insidious illegal wildlife trade that devastates communities and species. And that includes the indigenous people who protect 80% of global biodiversity, like 11 Honduran communities protecting the last stronghold of their national bird, the scarlet macaw. And I invite every country to work closely with the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, and to join the Global Ocean Alliance to protect at least 30% of the world's land and ocean by 2030. But we know that public money is not going to do the job. We need more than public money can provide. So governments need to identify and use the powerful levers that they uniquely hold to help markets learn to attach value to nature and cost to environmental destruction. Take on the perverse incentives that Barry was talking about at the beginning that drive environmental destruction. One example, the top 50 food producing countries spend around $700 billion a year on often destructive land use subsidies. That's 4 times bigger than all the world's aid agencies combined. In the UK, we're working through the Just Rural Transition. We're replacing our own land use subsidies with a new system that rewards good stewardship of the land, and we need other countries to do something similar. We've committed £120 million to partnerships for forests to make producing commodities we all rely on part of protecting tropical forests that are home to 80% of biodiversity. We've launched a new consultation on requiring big companies to remove deforestation from their supply chains to help shrink our footprint beyond our shores. And as COP26 president, we'll be bringing other countries together around the table, north, south, east, west, consumer, producer, developing, to shift the market and make forests worth more alive than dead. And I do want to commend China for taking steps to exclude illegal forest products from its supply chains. That is really good news, and I really, really strongly encourage them to finish that job. The impact will be tremendous and global. And I'm so pleased that Minister Huang has agreed with my colleague Alok Sharma, the UN Climate COP President designate, that our two countries should work closer together as incoming presidents for ambitious integrated outcomes at both summits. As COP26 presidents, the UK is asking governments to come to Glasgow with genuinely ambitious, nationally determined contributions. We're calling for a race to zero right across society as well. And we welcome China's announcement at the UN on achieving carbon neutrality before 2060 and enhancing its own NDC. And we look forward to hearing more about that and working closely together. Action for nature has to be just as ambitious all around the world. Indeed, the leaders of both our countries have been clear on the need to tackle these crises together. And we're looking forward to the high-level dialogue with China's Ministry for Ecology and Environment over the coming weeks. At Kunming, we need to agree ambitious targets to reverse biodiversity loss, but we also need to underpin them with robust implementation plans, meaningful accountability, and we'll be pushing for a coherent approach across all three Rio conventions. Finally, the UK is committed to providing leadership, working with friends from small island developing states to the African Union. And in Rwanda, we'll build on the collaboration of the Commonwealth family too, because the window is closing. And we have a stark, but objectively, I think, a very simple choice. We can lock in decades of carbon emissions and environmental destruction, or we can turn this grim pandemic experience into something positive by making sustainability and resilience the lens through which we map out our respective recoveries. And we have a duty now to every generation to come to profoundly reset our relationship with this, the only planet that can sustain us. And whatever else might distract or divide us, we have to work together to achieve this. So I just want to thank you again for all your contributions. And Barry, thanks for organizing and hosting this hugely important event.
Thank you so much. And, you know, again, that thread that's run through all the speeches today, shared responsibility, you used the phrase duty there. And I think it's really how seriously we take this, that it is a shared responsibility, but we must see it as a duty to the next generation and to the world at large. So great to have your words there, Zach. We now go to the fun part. Please use the chat room, everyone, as I see many of you already doing, to pose questions, make comments. I'll try and incorporate those into the ones that some of you have already submitted. And straight away, I want to go to Colombia and Senator Santiago Valencia, who I know is wanting to ask a particular question. Senator Santiago. Hello, if you're there, can you unmute?
Sorry, he's just waiting to be admitted. He's in the waiting room.
Okay.
Senator, are you there?
Senator?
Hello to everyone. I'm sorry, I'm just in a discussion here in our committee, but thank you very much for having us here. I apologize for being in and out all this time, but we're working on a really important matters here in Colombia. First of all, thank you all for having us here. For us, it's a great opportunity to share with you knowledge and experiences from all the globe. So I'm really happy to be here with you all. I want to ask a question to Minister Lee White from Ghana, Minister of Water Forest. disease and environment. And my question would be, how should governments be integrating natural capital into their governance and accounting frameworks? Thank you very much.
Okay. Minister White, I don't know if you caught that that question. It was directed to you, I think, about.
Yes, sir, please.
Hello, Minister White, are you there? Please?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Did you hear the question? I'll let you answer it.
I did indeed. Putting me on the spot as Minister in charge of Sustainable Development, I'm trying very hard to convince my colleagues in economy and finance to do just that. I think to do it, we have to convince the financial people that that's the way to go, as Hank Paulson was saying. In Gabon, we've been working on many different examples of that we, to kind of use as a bait for the financial people. So an example is watershed protection. We've demonstrated that the watersheds above two of our biggest hydroelectric dams, which are protected by a national park, we calculated that had we not created the national park to create the watershed, we would be losing $15 million a year of electricity every year. And if in the part of the watershed that isn't protected today, we were to stop forestry and do more sensitive land use, we would actually produce $20 million per year more electricity. So I think we have to start with very concrete examples like that we can take to the financial people. The way Gabon is going about it is we passed a sustainable development law, which will oblige all companies and all institutions, even ministries in Gabon, to do an annual sustainable development report and to actually offset negative impacts on sustainability. And sustainability credits are a combination of carbon credits, biodiversity credits, and human capital credits. So a combination of, I think, case studies and then kind of national policies to try and gradually integrate nature into the annual budget, which I've been working on today.
Thank you very much. I'm going to call questioners in threes so that they're aware that they're about to be called. I'm going to ask my co-chair of the APPG, Theo Clark, to ask a question next, followed by Stanley Johnson, followed by Hannah Winkler.
Thank you very much, Barry, and Zach, nice to see you virtually. A number of you talked about the challenge for the poorest people living in developing countries and the impacts on them, and something we haven't talked too much about but is agriculture. So I suppose my question perhaps for Elizabeth and some of our international speakers is, how do we meet this growing demand for food and the needs of those in rural areas, and the need for agriculture, but at the same time also fostering biodiversity?
Very good. And could we take the questions in threes, and then I'll ask the ministers and the panel to respond. So next would be Stanley Johnson.
Yeah, did I just unmute my audio?
You're unmuted, Stanley. We can hear you.
Well, wonderful to be here. And I'm not still a parliamentarian, but I do feel honoured to be part of this group. I'm a former MEP. So there's,
you have a few connections, Stanley, so we'll admit it.
Well, thank you so much. I feel honoured. Well, I just want to congratulate Ambassador Li Xiaoping. It was a very, very moving speech he made, and also Zach. And the point where I want to come to at this moment is the idea which both of them spoke of, is the two secretariats and the two chairmen of these two parties, the COP and CBD, working together very closely in the run-up to the next conferences. And there's one area where I think is particularly timely for them to work on, particularly in the light of COVID and the financial demands which COVID is proposing. And that is to see if they can't actually finally move far and fast on what is called the carbon tax. The carbon tax area. I'm not talking about a worldwide carbon tax. I'm merely talking about an effort to move beyond what was in the original UNFCCC, taxing, as it were, emissions, to have this concept of net emissions, where you're taking also into account the carbon implications of imported goods. And now, it's not a difficult concept. It doesn't even require international agreement, but it does require a willingness by countries to use carbon taxes to advance sinks and reducing emissions. And I do think there will be a scope here in the few months we have for the two secretaries to work together and the two chairmen to work together. Zach, your remarks, I'm looking at you as I speak, your remarks were tremendously helpful about the links already going on between the two chairmen of the two conferences. So I think this particular area, and I say timely, because by Jove, we really are going to need money for all sorts of things, not just COVID programs, development programs, and all the environmental programs which your participants have been talking about. So can the secretariats, can the joint chairman really focus possibly on a joint approach on the financing via carbon taxes? Thank you so much.
And we move to South Africa and the Honourable Hannah Winkler.
I would also love to throw my question to the floor, Mr. MC, if you can allow me later.
Of course, yes. If you put it onto the chat, then I'll call you later. You're appearing as Galaxy A20 at the moment, so if we could have a name to go with it, that would be really helpful. Thank you so much. But is Hannah Winkler there?
Yes, I am. Thank you. I'm so sorry I didn't have my video switched on this evening. Unfortunately, I'm experiencing some network connectivity issues, and I'm happy to be here in the presence of my esteemed colleagues. The question is directed to Lord Zach Goldsmith. I'd like to know, consumption in the European Union and other wealthy nations continues to drive both emissions and biodiversity loss in the global south. What steps are you taking to measure this global footprint? Then my second, well, it's more of a commentary, is that there seems to be a lot of push and pull around post-COVID-19 economic recovery and what is perceived as trade-offs between growth, employment, and biodiversity preservation and protectionism, as well as the transition to decarbonization in the energy sector. And I do believe that these are antiquated views, very misleading, but they seem to be the prevailing views. How do we find a way, I think, to redirect the discourse and to dispel these myths about sustainable development, green development, and growing economies post-COVID-19? Thank you.
Grand. Thank you very much, Hannah. If we can, I think at least two of those questions were directed towards Lord Goldsmith, and one certainly also to Ambassador Liu. So if I could ask you to respond to those.
Shall I come in, Barry?
Please, yes, Zach.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'm going to address Stanley's point, but just before I do that, Theo, good to see you. The only thing I'd say is that if we don't address environmental destruction, the first people who are going to pay the price are the world's poorest people, whose dependence on nature and its free services are way more direct than ours. We can often feel insulated from nature. We're not, of course, in the real world, but there's a sort of gap between us and nature. But declining soil fertility around the world is already reducing yields for 500 million farmers around the world. That line is going down, not up. So you don't need to be a mathematician to know that it's going to end in a lot of people who are very poor already paying a big price. On Stanley's point, he's absolutely right. Stanley, as I said in the speech, you can't even if all the world's donor countries poured their money into nature, it's still not going to be enough. So governments have to do two things. They have to identify those levers that governments have. And that's why I think the subsidy issue is so important. If $700 billion is the number that scientists tend to put to what they call the nature gap, 700 billion a year is what's required to turn the tide on nature destruction. Well, $700 billion is also coincidentally how much governments pay in land use subsidies around the world. And if we can shift the way those subsidies are invested and pour it into a system that is conditional upon looking after nature, that could flip the market. So I think that's massively important. And the other thing is private finance. And we haven't talked so much about this in this session, but we need to mobilize private finance. And one of the ways of doing that is by resolving the problems around Article 6 in the COP negotiations. It's just fantastically important that we do. And I think in order to do it, we need to attach as much quality control to the supply side, i.e. the projects, really making sure that the money is going into proper projects that supports nature and people, but also on the demand side. So companies need to have a really clear plan for achieving net zero themselves in order to qualify to be part of global trusted carbon markets. But I think we can do that. And I think there's big demand there. It would be possible already to create a coalition of countries ambitious enough to do this. And there are plenty of companies who are taking climate change very, very seriously, but who can't get to net zero overnight and therefore will rely on these markets. And that could facilitate the transfer of billions. And the last point for Stanley is a real general one, is that the challenge we have, if you condensed it all down to one thing, it's reconciling the market, reconciling the economy with nature. That's the challenge. The market's the most powerful force for change other than nature itself. But until it learns to value nature and cost things that we don't like, pollution and waste and extinctions and so on, that power will be driving us towards the cliff. So reconciling the two is the challenge. And that means internalizing the externalities, which is what you were referring to in your question. And the very last thing, Hannah, so you're absolutely right. We commissioned the Global Resource Initiative to tell us how we could deal with our overseas environmental footprint and to avoid offshoring emissions through our supply chains. And we're responding now to the recommendations. There were 14, but the top one was that we initiated due diligence requirement on businesses in the UK that import commodities to make sure they're not importing environmental destruction, particularly deforestation. So I can't respond to that now, I'm afraid, because the government has a process that it has to go through. But I can tell you that I'm very hopeful that we'll end up in a place where we are requiring that to happen, and we are then going to be able to build an alliance of countries around the world who hopefully will join us in doing similar. And I know China actually have been talking in a really interesting way about cleaning up their own supply chains in the way that we are. And if China does that, huge country, hugely important, that will be, again, gigantically important.
Well, the ambassador is here, so he's heard what you've had to say, Zach, and of course part of the question specifically on carbon tax was addressed to China. So Ambassador Liu, please, your floor is yours.
I'd like to give you some ideas about China's red line system for ecological protection. The ecological red line is a national level lifeline. This is an important innovation for national spatial planning and management. It plays an important role in protecting the security of ecosystem, maintaining function of ecosystem, and facilitating sustainable development of economy and society. By the end of 2020, the ecological red line areas will have covered 25% of the land territory in China. And second, the ecological red line is drawn at each level down the chain of government spatial planning. The areas under special protection are important ecologically functional zones and ecologically vulnerable areas. They cover all types of nature reserves, with the national parks being the main component. These areas are under strict management so as to reduce disruptions to eco-environment by human activities. By the end of 2018, China had 11,800 nature reserves of all types. They covered 1.728 million square kilometers and over 18% of China's land area. This has exceeded, ahead of schedule, the goal of designating 17% of land area as nature reserves by 2020, which was set by COP10. Lastly, the ecological resources in ecological red line areas are utilized in a rational way. The red lines must not be trampled upon in whatever we do, whether it's protecting biodiversity, adjusting economic structure, planning for industrial development, or promoting new type of urbanization. However, this does not mean absolute no use of resources in all these areas. Nor are these areas no man's land or off limits to development. The Chinese government encourages the sustainable use of high quality ecological resources in these areas and exploration of ways to tap the value of ecological products. In other words, we're working to turn clear water and green mountains into mountains of gold and silver and translate ecological strength into economic gains. Furthermore, in light with the spirit of Convention of Biological Diversity, China has issued the China National Biodiversity Conservation Strategy and Action Plan 2011 to 2030. This document outlines the overall targets, strategic tasks, and priorities of biological conservation in China in the coming 20 years. Since 2015, China has conducted wildlife survey and monitoring and a major biodiversity conservation project, logging more than 1.2 million entries. Continued efforts have also been made to track and evaluate the progress in implementation of a strategy and action plan. China stands ready to enhance communication with all parties on the ecological red line system and facilitate each other in implementing our respective national action plans. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that very, very full response. I'm now going to call the Honourable Chachu Ganya who co-chairs the caucus in Kenya, followed by Honourable Brooks, who co-chairs the Botswana caucus. And after that, I'll be calling on Cedric Froelich from South Africa. So if we could have Honourable Chachu Ganya first. If you could unmute.
Hello, yes, I have. Thank you. And thanks for a very good presentation. I just want to ask one question to the Ambassador Lu, the Ambassador of China to the United Kingdom. And my question is, as China progresses its One Belt, One Road initiative, how can this initiative help countries develop more sustainably and focus on clean, green development pathways? I thank you.
Thank you. And if we could now move to Honourable Sam Brooks from Botswana.
Hello.
Hi, great. You're with us.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Honourable Brooks, please continue.
Thank you, Director of Ceremony. My question goes to Barbara. How has the CEF focused its support on the programs that will contribute to the implementation of the COP15 and COP26 objectives? Thank you. That's the question I wanted to throw to the floor.
Okay.
Just get clarity. How has the what? Sorry, I didn't get the first part of the question.
How has the CEF?
How is the GEF?
Its support on the programs that will contribute to the implementation of the COP15 and 26 objectives.
Barbara, I think he directed at you. It may also be that Carlos Manuel would wish to come in on that question. If we could also ask Cedric Froelich from South Africa to put his question. Thank you, Cedric.
Well, thank you very much, Barry, and thank you for the panelists for a very insightful discussion and inputs. I want to preface my question by citing a recent article in the scientific journal Environmental Science and Technology that estimates that globally 129 billion disposable face masks and 65 billion throwaway gloves are used every month through the COVID pandemic, and also noting that up to 80% of these products can end up ultimately in drains and can end up in the oceans and the seas of the world. And the question to the panelists, especially from the ambassador from China, the minister from South Africa, Minister Barbara Creasy, and also the gentleman who gave a very input from the UK, is that haven't we reached the point where we need to consider amending the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea to ensure that the resources of the marine environment are used sustainably and are protected from pollution by land-based activities? Thank you very much.
Some great questions there. Please, who's going to go first? Our first question was from Chachaganya. I think that was directed at Ambassador Liu.
Okay, let me talk briefly about Belt and Road Initiative, Green Development. I think Belt and Road Initiative is a path to both economic prosperity and green development. China has followed the concept of green development in building BRI. We have aligned the BRI development with the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We built, operated, and managed infrastructure in a green and low carbon way, emphasized ecological conservation in investment and trade, cooperated with participating parties on environmental conservation, biodiversity protection, and climate action. We're ready to enhance cooperation on building green BRI with other countries in the following three aspects. First, to develop green mechanisms. In 2019, the BRI International Green Development Coalition was launched. It consists of 10 thematic partnerships, including one on biodiversity and ecosystem management. Now this coalition has more than 150 partners in over 40 countries. China has launched the Green Silk Road Envoys program to help other developing countries build up their capacity of environmental protection. Through this program, we have helped train more than 2,000 officials, experts, and technicians from over 120 countries. The Chinese government has also established the Belt and Road Environmental Technology Transfer Center to facilitate the joint R&D and application of advanced technologies for ecological and environmental protection. Second, we encourage green development. In designing and building BRI projects, Chinese companies take in full consideration the need for conservation as well as economic development. For example, when Chinese companies built Karachi-Lahore Highway in Pakistan, they planted nearly 300,000 trees and more than 5 million square meters of grassland along the road. So along with the new road infrastructure, they also contribute to the local environment. Also in Pakistan, when building the Habuka Thor coal power plant, Chinese companies applied advanced clean coal technologies and set aside 10% of the budget for pollution prevention and control. So the emissions was completely up to standard. Lastly, in building the Belt and Road, we enhanced cooperation in green finance. more than 30 large financial institutions around the world have signed the Green Investment Principles for Belt and Road. In doing so, they are committed to a full understanding of environmental, social, and governance risks, full disclosure of environmental information, making full use of green financial tools, adopting green supply chain management, etc. China encourages financial institutions to support the building of a green BRI. In 2019, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China issued the first green bond and the Belt and Road Interbank Regular Cooperation Mechanism. This was a big step forward in deepening financial cooperation on green BRI. China remains committed to open, green, and sustainable development. We stand ready to carry out third-party market cooperation with developed countries, including the UK, on building a green Belt and Road. And we will help more countries along the BRI route to achieve green, clean, and sustainable development via platforms such as Belt and Road International Alliance for Green Development. Thank you.
Very, very much. And it's extraordinarily complex question and an extraordinarily comprehensive answer. And I think many of us will want to look very carefully at what you've just said, Ambassador. So if we can move to the other questions that that were asked from Cedric Froelich and from I'm looking at who anyway, from maybe from Cedric Froelich first, and then I'll remember who it was that asked the other question.
Well, let me take first bite. I mean, I think that obviously we need to take very drastic measures to deal with the pollution that is entering into our oceans. And in particular, I think the problem of plastic pollution, which we know is having a significant effect not only on biodiversity within the ocean environment, but also on fish stocks and sustainable food sources. But I think that it's important to recognize that the causes of ocean marine pollution are complicated. So I think the question of ensuring that all communities have access to effective household waste collection is the first and most important step. The second one is that obviously there's got to be lots of public education about why we shouldn't throw litter around and where that litter ultimately ends up and what impact it has on our own lives. And thirdly, I think that there is the question of involvement of the private sector in reducing particularly single-use plastics and other forms of packaging in the value chain, because I think that this is really what is contributing to this terrible problem that we have. Maybe if I can just say a few words on the GEF issue before handing to Carlos. I mean, South Africa is privileged to be a significant beneficiary of the GEF as well as of other multilateral organizations such as the UNDP, the World Bank and UNEP. And we do receive billions in support that would go into restoration of water sources. We also use this money to combat illicit wildlife crime and also to support what we call bioprospecting. And I think that this is a really interesting area because it links to the points that were being made earlier about how can we ensure food security and livelihoods without disrupting the environment. And we have significant programs where we are cultivating indigenous plants for both cosmetic, pharmaceutical and food purposes. And I think that those programs really help you to use land in a way that doesn't have to conflict with the environment. And you can also introduce a whole range of other concepts such as predator control, use of toxins, and so on and so forth. So I think that it's entirely possible to have this compatible land use. But as other speakers have said, it does require us to think a little bit laterally. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Carlos, would you like to respond to the part of the question that was oriented towards Jeff and funding?
Yes, pleasure, Barry. In order to have a clear perspective of the global financial need, and it was not until very recently that we have all the numbers, the financial gap is huge. And this is not just an effort of mobilizing more resources from the north to the south. It's a combination of dealing with perverse incentives and negative subsidies, what I call policy coherence. If we were more coherent in how we invest at the global and national level, the financial gap will decrease in probably 50%, as we understand that we need to mobilize more efficiently resources from all sources. 80% of what is annually invested in climate mitigation and nature conservation are public expenditures. 20% is ODA, being bilateral, multilateral, private sector, and this is where the GEF is located. We normally negotiate and work just on the 20%. We don't work at the global level on that 80%, which is public expenditures, what every single country is doing. That is why the role of ICCF and the members of parliaments are key in the discussion, because they are the ones who approve and allocate financial resources at the country level. First, they need to understand that it's in their own self-interest to mobilize more efficiently. And second, ICCF has been kind of a leader in supporting new innovative financial instrument at the domestic level. If we're able to really understand how do we focus on leveraging resources, we will narrow that gap sooner than what we expect. And I hope that by 2030, we will be mobilizing 1% of global GDP. The human, economic, and social benefits are evident. So we got this very concrete political challenge, particularly at the Parliament Congress level, so we can generate data and information so decision makers at the executive and parliament level feel confident that the decisions that are being taken are providing good sound benefits. In this context, the GF plans to continue being a catalyzer investment, providing knowledge and understanding on how resources can be mobilized more efficiently with higher impact.
Yeah, thank you. I think we need to get you to sit around the table with Hank Paulson and a few other financiers, and we need to really ramp up the funding that is available to the GEF, so that supportive work that you do to all of the countries can really be maximized. Now, thank you for that. Now, the other question, of course, was the question that came in from Honourable Sam Brooks, and that was about the implementation of COP 15 and 16. I noticed that it's been very difficult to pick up on that part of Cedric Froelic's question, which is about UNCLOS. And I'm going to pounce, I think, here on our Minister for the Pacific, Lord Goldsmith, to get his views specifically on that, because it's a really complex one, and perhaps also Ambassador Liu, which I think Honourable Froelich directed the question partly towards as well, because the law of the sea is one of these multilateral institutions which is so fundamental to global governance, and we need to be doing more to protect our oceans. So if I could ask you to respond, both of you, to that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Shall I go first?
Please, yes.
Right, thank you for that. I mean, it is a really difficult question, and it is hugely complex and multidimensional. I mean, broadly, the UK is committed to upholding UNCLOS, the legal framework for all activities in the ocean and seas. And I think it does theoretically provide the forum that we need to resolve these issues, these huge challenges. But the real challenge is getting countries to work together in good faith, as is often the case with international challenges of these sort. I mean, look, UNCLOS is the legal framework for BBNJ, the discussions beyond national jurisdiction, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. We need agreement at BBNJ if we're going to deliver the 30 by 30, which the Global Ocean Alliance that the UK launched and is running. We've got a lot of countries signed up, but we can't realistically deliver. I mean, theoretically we could, but in the real world, we can't deliver 30 by 30 unless we have agreement at BBNJ. So I don't think creating a new forum or even introducing new rules is necessarily the way to do it. I think countries just have to get around the table and negotiate in good faith. And that is, I'm afraid to say, the reason we haven't got where we need to get to. There is an issue of finance as well. And one of the things we're looking at is how we could raise finance. There's not a lot of money out there for ocean-related issues. And it feels to me that there's a gap in the market there. And I know the World Bank is looking to fill that gap. And that's something that we're very interested in. Can I just make one other very brief point on the finance? I mean, Carlos is right in what he said. Just want to make it's not all about new money. So new money for Jeff or new money for GCF or new money from ODA or whatever it happens to be. It's all, as Carlos said, it's the money that is spent day in, day out by governments around the world. And one of the things we're going to have to do pretty quickly is reconcile all of our respective portfolios with Paris and reconcile all of our respective portfolios with nature. And there are already lots of commitments that are appearing around Paris compliance. So our own ODA, for example, is becoming Paris compliant. That's a commitment we made. The whole of government needs to be Paris compliant, not just ODA. And nature compliance is more difficult because it's so much more multidimensional than carbon, but it has to happen. And at the very least, the big MDBs need to ensure that their portfolios at least do no harm to nature, but ideally have a nature positive effect, a net gain effect. And that's, you know, the UK is a big contributor to the MDB system. In some areas we're the biggest contributor. And it certainly feels to me that we could use that leverage to be a bit bossier with some of the MDBs in relation to nature proofing their portfolios. So we've got to sort the money that's there. We've got to ensure that we haven't got two streams of money going in opposite directions. And the very last point I have to make, Barry, is that I'm really sorry, but I can't stay on the call. I'm now over time. I really apologize for that, but I've got a call that I was meant to make 13 minutes ago. So unless there's any burning reason you need me to stay, I'm going to have to go. But I'm waiting for a nod of approval from you.
We're very grateful for all the time that you spent with us, Zach, and I'm particularly grateful for that last answer that you've given, because I think it's a very difficult, very sensitive answer to what is an extraordinarily complex question. But thank you for the time that you spent with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much. Good pleasure.
Thank you, Zach.
Ambassador, if I can turn to you perhaps also to respond to the question about UNCLOS.
China is a signature to the UNCLOS, and we are committed to upholding the principles of UNCLOS in every spirit. I mentioned about the importance we attach to the ecological conservation on land. We also apply equal importance. We attach equal importance to protection of the ocean. You know, China now has established about 270 ocean protective areas, and that's a big increase comparing the previous years. And because we realize that when we talk about biodiversity, it not only applies to land, but also to ocean. And we notice the deterioration of the situation on sea, on ocean, on waters, and especially some of the endangered species is increasing. And we adopt very forceful measures and policies, including fishing close decision, that not only apply to the big rivers, lakes in China, but also to the coastal ocean areas. So I believe that this will be one of the issues, one of the areas that international community should build up consensus should exert more efforts to protect. I hope and I believe COP15 and COP26 will provide opportunities for countries together to put together searching for solutions to address these challenges.
Thank you very much. That's really, really positive and really helpful. The next three questioners that I would like to call are Right Honourable Chris Grayling, Lord Randall, and Wayne Stetsky from Canada. Chris, if you can unmute.
Yep. Hello, everyone. One of the things that's been very clear to me in recent weeks is that the consequence of the pandemic in many parts of the world is going to be disastrous, and that we are likely as a global community to face humanitarian crises in different parts, particularly the developing world, over the next 12 to 18 months, particularly if the pandemic continues in the way that it is at the moment. In that situation, we have, it seems to me, two choices. We can either provide support in the conventional way through conventional aid routes, or we could actually do something much more positive, which is to put the aid money we provide into paying those communities that are struggling economically because of the pandemic to restore their natural ecosystems. I personally prefer the second approach to the first, and I would encourage parliamentarians around the world to challenge governments, to challenge budget holders to look at ways of doing this as we meet the inevitable humanitarian challenges that arise from the pandemic.
Thank you. And Lord Randall?
Right. I think the fact is that all of us on this call today really share the same views of the scale of the problem facing nature biodiversity. Many of on the call, I exclude myself, I have the luxury of being a politician that doesn't have to be elected anymore. Many of you are going to be have to face your electorate. How can you actually persuade those people, particularly those hardest hit by the pandemic, but generally we know that the economic problems caused by the loss of nature, but it's not always what appears to them. So that's, I think that's a challenge. And when we're talking about this very important CBD in Kunming, how can we get our fellow citizens engaged in seeing this as such an important thing that it is?
Thank you, Lord Randall. That's one of course, one of the AHE targets was about education and building that public support. So a really important point. And if I could call Wayne Stetsky now.
Thank you. I really appreciate being part of this very important discussion. Of course, I live in the Rocky Mountain areas of British Columbia, where biodiversity and the economy are side by side. We can't have one without the other. My question is for the ambassador. I had the pleasure of being in China 2 years ago for the twinning of Giant Panda National Park in China with Canada's Jasper and Elk Island parks, and then attended the Climate Change Summit in Beijing after that. And I want to commend China for the targets that you have set for fighting climate change and for protecting biodiversity. My question is, and you touched on it a little bit, but the relationship between China's red line policy on biodiversity and strategic action plans. Of course, in Canada and the US, we have national biodiversity strategic action plans with up to 19 different targets. So I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on the relationship between your red line policy, and you mentioned that you have strategic plans to deliver on it.
Grant. So if we can take those perhaps in the order that they were delivered. Chris, you directed your question primarily to whom?
A really general question for the panel, to be honest.
Okay.
And indeed for those attending generally.
So open season now, right? Well, that's grand. Ambassador, would you like to, one of the questions was very specifically to you. I think Lord Randall's question is probably more appropriately addressed by an elected politician, and therefore I would look to Barbara Creasy or Minister White to address those.
Why doesn't Minister White take first bite? He hasn't spoken yet.
Okay, indeed. Lee?
Hello, hello again. You know, I find that certainly in Gabon, people understand the importance of biodiversity and nature and so on. Problem is often convincing my fellow politicians, fellow ministers, particularly budget ministers, to take these things seriously. But there's, you know, throughout Africa, there's a real connection between people and biodiversity. It's true that when industrials come in, we sometimes lose touch with that. But I think a lot of it is about we need sort of engaging stories. We need to make these issues personal. I just, as well as being now a politician, I'm also a scientist, and I published a paper in Science about 3 weeks ago, showing that we've lost 80% of the fruit production in the rainforest in central Gabon over the last 35 years that we've been watching it. And the elephants are thinner than they were 20 years ago. So elephants are hungry because of climate change. Climate change is impacting the fruiting of the forest. And we're suspecting now that the reason crop raiding is going up in rural Gabon is because the elephants are hungry and they're leaving the forest looking for food. And I really pushed to publish that study because I thought it was a fairly simple idea that we can get across to a global public. Climate change, hungry elephants, hungry rural children in Africa because their crops are being eaten by these starving elephants. So I think more storytelling and more real life stories that engage the global public.
Yeah. Yes, engaging people does require that narrative framework. I think that's absolutely right. Now, Chris's question, I think, was directed perhaps partly to Carlos and perhaps partly to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, could I maybe ask you to speak to that one?
I will appreciate if you can help me just to repeat few words of the question.
I think, well, Chris, it's probably better that you repeat your own question. Yes.
So the point I wanted to make and get a reaction to is, it feels to me that inevitably in some parts of the developing world, the economic collapse caused by the pandemic will lead to serious humanitarian issues. The conventional way to respond would be just simply providing aid. An unconventional way might be to fund those communities to restore the natural ecosystems in their areas. I prefer that approach, but I'd be very interested to hear what the panel say, but also to kind of just make that point to parliamentarians attending this meeting, that we should all be pushing for that, in my view.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think it depends also the magnitude of the nature of the problem. For instance, currently we are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, which needs I would say, for instance, support on medical equipment or health system general, because it is needed now. Otherwise, more people will continue to lose their lives or get sick. But in the long term, I agree with you, support to the local communities so that they can rebuild their life. But that also has to be accompanied with more of public awareness on why the long term, what are we trying to achieve? We know, for instance, now that, or at least the scientists seem to confirm that the current situation of the pandemic had to do with our actions on nature. has to do with our expansive agriculture, which have interfered with the wild space. And that's why human beings then got closer to animals, and spillover and transmission of the zoonotic diseases from animals to human beings. So basically, in terms of helping communities, is also need to be accompanied with awareness of the dangers of such actions also as they build the long-term future. So as I say, both, if the problem is for now to save lives, that support will be needed. But I think focus should be in the long term, both prevention, but also helping them to sustain and continue with their lives long term with public awareness as necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Ambassador, did you want to respond briefly to what Wayne Stetsky said about the red line policy? I know you spent some time previously in your remarks outlining parts of that, but if you could pick up what Wayne was asking there, that would be very helpful.
Certainly. I think this red line is a part of China National Biodiversity Conservation Strategy and Action Plan. You know, we have formulated this strategy and action plan. We call it 2011 and 2030. We have the target or goal, short term by 2015. The goal is to strive to control effectively the declining trend of biodiversity in key areas. Midterm goal, that is by 2020, will strive to basically control diversity decline and loss. The long-term goal, that is by 2030, will achieve that biodiversity in China will be effectively protected. And in addition to this target, we also formulate 8 tasks, what we call it strategic tasks, and together with the 10 priority areas and the 30 priority actions. So red line areas is one of the strategic tasks, and is also included in the priority areas and 30 priority actions. It's part of our plan and it's a part of our strategy and actions. So previous speakers also mentioned about how to get the public participation in COP15. That is also included in the strategy. The task 8 is to raise public awareness and strengthen international cooperation and exchanges. You know, we believe that COP15 is an international conference, but it's not only for governments. It's also for NGO, for institutions, private sectors. And during the conference, there will be fringe events which will involve the private sectors and academia, media, think tank, private institutions. The purpose is to get the public participation and to raise public awareness of ecological conservation. Same can be said about COP26. In addition to sending a senior government representatives for the conference, we are also going to set up what we call the China Corner in Glasgow. That will be participated by private sectors, companies, academia, think tank, college, universities. So I think there will be more active participation by public for these 2 conferences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you've nicely answered both Wayne's question, and also referred to bring in Lord Randall's about that wider engagement of the public. So thank you for doing that so elegantly. And I have one final question, and that is from Dorothy Tembo. If Dorothy's still with us. Dorothy, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Ah, grand. Thank you so much.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry that I want to put on my video because my internet bandwidth is very low. But thanks to everyone for elaborating more on the CBD, but also COP. My question goes to Barbara. Oh, I didn't say who I am. I'm Dorothy Tembo Chema, working with the Long Wildlife Trust in Malawi, and I'm representing Malawi Parliamentary Conservation Caucus. So I wanted to ask about the role of CBD, as we know that there's strong evidence that the landscapes such as the Malawi-Zambia Transfrontier Conservation Area Initiative will become increasingly important because the eastern range of Southern Africa becomes hotter, but also wetter. And also, we know that if it becomes hotter and wetter, especially the southern part, it means that our animals, biodiversity will be affected, and then they'll also get hotter and drier. Then how is the CBD trying to help in balancing the biodiversity, at the same time the growth and development for some of the poorest people in Africa?
Thank you. And I note that Julieta Matias Rabago is also back with us. I know she's been very diligent, both in her voting record in the Mexican House of Deputies, in the Mexican Congress, and in coming in and out of the event that we have here. So Julieta, thank you. I believe you also had a question. If you can unmute. Maybe whilst Juliet is
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Hi. Good afternoon. I'm Julieta Marcel Rábago, member of the lower chamber in the Mexican Congress. First, I'd like to greet His Excellency Barry Gardiner for this invitation. I also want to greet His Excellency Lord Zach Goldsmith. Well, I feel proud and honored to represent my country in such a relevant summit that will undoubtedly pave the way towards the conference of the parties of the Convention of Biological Diversity. I'd like to ask His Excellency Lord Goldsmith the following. En Spanish. Hoy más que nunca se evidencia la estrecha conexión de la salud humana con la salud del planeta. Un reporte reciente elaborado por WWF muestra que América Latina es la región que más biodiversidad pierde a nivel mundial. Perdón, estoy en sesión y bueno, estamos en medio de un momento crítico, con una discusión pues complicada. Pero regresando, tenemos una oportunidad única para revertir esta tendencia y abanderar las metas de conservación y desarrollo sustentable alrededor de una especie emblemática que una a todos los países de la región, el jaguar. Vemos con preocupación que proyectos como el Tren Maya en México son ejemplos de actividades humanas que profundizan la vulnerabilidad que esta y otras especies en riesgo ya enfrentan, a pesar de que existe evidencia científica en el sentido de que conservar y restaurar los hábitats del jaguar es una oportunidad para proteger a centenares de especies, asegurar servicios ambientales vitales para las personas, mitigar el cambio climático, generar... I'm sorry. Ok, mi pregunta es, ¿cuál es el rol de las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza para alcanzar los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible? ¿Y cuál es la relación entre las dos COP que se llevarán a cabo el siguiente año? Gracias.
Yes, thank you. I'm hoping if you can now. Thank you very much. I'm hoping that one of our colleagues on the Zoom who both speak Spanish and could hear what you were saying, because it was very difficult to hear over the background sound from the Congress, can interpret for us. My understanding was, I think I caught enough of what you said. My understanding is that you were wanting to find out how nature-based solutions could play a role in both the CBD and in addressing the climate change challenge. If that's not correct, then please do tell me, or somebody who speaks much better Spanish than I do can interject. But
the chat.
Question has been typed in the chat.
Okay.
The question is, what is a role that nature-based solutions can play in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and which would you say is a relation between the two COPs that will be held next year, climate change and biodiversity?
I wasn't too far out. Come on, Sachin, you've got to give me that.
That was close, Barry.
Okay, very good. So two final questions before we close. The first one I think was addressed to Barbara Creasy from Dorothy.
Thank you. I suppose the link between the two COPs has to be that climate change is posing one of the biggest threats that we have to biodiversity. And even if we were to achieve this wonderful target of 30 by 30, and we failed to stop climate change, we would not stop loss of biodiversity and the mass extinction of species. So it's very important, in my view, it's very important that we have to look at these two processes together. And we have to understand that they are integrally linked. In fact, I would argue with the third COP, which is the COP against desertification, that I think takes us to the problems that we face in sub-Saharan Africa, where climate change is making countries hotter and drier. So that's my first point. You have to look at the three together, and you have to look at a way of solving all the problems. They can't be solved separately from each other. The second point I would want to make is that if we believe, and I think that we would want to argue that people living in developing countries are currently the custodians of biodiversity. We were having a very interesting discussion earlier as to how do you monetize ecosystem services, and how do you put a price on the services that forests, rainforests, water catchments, wetlands, and so on perform for humanity as a whole. And if you do that, how do you make sure that you have equal benefit sharing amongst those who are living in the poorest communities in the world? And I think that there is some very, very interesting work which is being done on this, but I don't think that we yet have all the answers that we would need to have to make this a reality. I would just want to go back to the question that was raised earlier about whether in responding, Chris's question, in responding to the COVID pandemic, should we consider support for communities living on the edge of protected areas? And should we consider support for communities who are involved in protection of ecosystem services? And I would just want to share with him that our own public employment program in response to the COVID pandemic is doing exactly that. So we're creating public works programs, and we're restoring wetlands and water sources and removing alien vegetation and so on. We have had those programs for a long time, but we are ramping them up as part of our COVID public employment. And I would want to suggest that there are many countries across the globe who would need to benefit from that and who might not be in the sort of position that our country is in to support those programs from the fiscus. So I do think that those are very important issues, and they do help us to begin to put in place mechanisms to support ecosystem services and to ensure that the poorest of the poor benefit from that work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. If we can perhaps ask either Ambassador Liu or Elizabeth Moreno or Carlos to add their comments.
Okay, I want to talk about the coordination and activity of COP15 and COP26. Now, at the UN Summit on Biodiversity, President Xi Jinping said, man and nature are interdependent. So it is our belief that in global governance on environment, international community must focus on both climate change and biodiversity. Protecting biodiversity helps mankind mitigate and adapt to climate change. Mitigation and adaptation to climate change will in turn reduce the threats on biodiversity. The two are the two sides of the same coin. So I think China and UK and together with other countries should step up coordination in the following three aspects to create synergy between the two conferences. First, I think China and the UK can work together to improve ecological conservation. Climate change and biodiversity bear on the survival and development of mankind. COP15 and COP26 create opportunities for us to explore a path to harmonious coexistence between man and nature and a balance between growth and conservation. We must respect, protect, and follow the law of nature. We must assume our responsibility for human civilization. Second, I think China and UK can work together to achieve green development. Climate change and biodiversity matter a great deal to economic recovery in the post-pandemic world. We should stay on course to meet the goals of UN 2030 agenda and remain committed to green, inclusive, and sustainable development. So through hosting COP15 and COP26, China and the UK can explore opportunities for growth in conservation, balance ecological conservation with high quality growth, and build up the dynamism for post-pandemic recovery. Third and lastly, China and UK can work together to safeguard multilateralism. International conventions, including Convention on Biological Diversity, United Nations Framework, Convention on Climate Change, and its Paris Agreement, are the legal basis for governance on environment. They are also important outcomes of multilateral cooperation. They enjoy extensive support and participation. COP15 and COP26 are the best venues for China and the UK to uphold the international system with the UN at its core, safeguard the dignity and authority of international rules, and gather international support for environmental governance. Both China and the UK attach great importance to nature-based solution, NBS. as some people ask about this question. We believe this is an important topic for COP26. China and UK can work together to promote the application of MBS, which helps with the coordinated settlement of climate change and loss of biological diversity. It also helps promote the green, low carbon, and sustainable development in the world. China, together with New Zealand, led the MBS efforts at the UN Climate Action Summit 2019, issued MBS outcomes at the summit, including policy proposal on nature-based solutions, and set up a group of Friends for Nature-Based Solutions as a platform for follow-up cooperation. China has also contributed its wisdom by proposing an MBS action initiative. It is called Drawing a Red Line for Ecological Protection to Mitigate and Adapt to Climate Change. So China stands ready to step up communications and cooperation with the UK on MBS. We should encourage all parties to value nature and urge governments, financial institutions, businesses, and other stakeholders to give MBS priority in protecting biodiversity and tackling climate change, to make ambitious plans and take concrete actions.
Thank you, Ambassador. That's really a positive note from you. We're drawing to a close. We have less briefly to ask Carlos Manuel Rodriguez and Elizabeth Marema as the two executive secretaries that we have here briefly to conclude for us and wrap things up. Carlos, perhaps you first. If you can unmute. No, in which case, can I go to Elizabeth Marema? Elizabeth, thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry. As last words, first, sincere thanks to parliamentarians for seeing the importance of climate change and biodiversity and have this space to discuss. And clearly parliamentarians have recognized, as the Chinese ambassador has just told us, the link between climate change and biodiversity loss, and that we cannot deal with one in isolation to the other. And that clearly, as the ambassador has underlined, also the connection between COP15 in China and COP26 in Glasgow, and the issues to be dealt with, how connected they are. And the connecting factor is what he mentioned at the end, that both under biodiversity solutions, or part of the solutions for reversing and halting biodiversity loss and adapting and mitigating climate change is on nature-based solution. So again, we have these types of solutions which unify climate crisis and biodiversity loss, and clearly indicating the link. And that link will lead now that discussion from China to Glasgow, and hopefully the global community will be able to agree on that dual twin agenda, for which the solution, both are looking at nature to provide greater part of that solution, those solutions. Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists who've joined us today. I want to thank all the legislators who've joined us and contributed today. I think we've had a wonderful discussion. There is so much to think through in what has been discussed. And I just want to end by saying we look forward to being together in physical form, not simply in virtual form, in Kunming next year, as one of the most important contributions that we can make to ensuring the future sustainability, not just of the other species on this planet, but the sustainability of human life, on which we've heard today that everything is interdependent. So thank you to everyone who's joined. I wish you well. Keep safe in these very strange times. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you for leading us through this phase. Thank you, parliamentarian.
Thank you.
We welcome you all to Kunming next year.